Okay, well, thank you for coming. Could you please state your name and who you're representing and your interests?
Carolyn Atkin, Acting Chief Executive Officer of the Victorian Council of Social Service.
And Llewellyn Reynders, Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the Victorian Council of Social Service. Okay,
thank you. Will we have your submission, which we've read, and quite a detailed one, but maybe you could say, generally give us an indication of what it's about, and we might have some questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. Overall, VCOS welcomed the draft report of the Victorian Taxi Industry Inquiry. We endorse its general direction and regulatory approach, and particularly welcome those elements that are promoting greater accessibility for people who are experiencing disadvantage in our community. We have been very much welcomed the opportunity of being proud to assist the inquiry throughout its process, and look forward to working with the government around the implementation of the inquiry. We recognise that the taxi industry has resisted reform for many decades, and that achieving lasting change, and what is proposed is quite transformational change, will require a root and branch approach and changes that will rely both on political will but also technical changes. VCOS particularly welcomed and support the recommendations around increasing supply, competitiveness and accountability of taxi services, improving driver training, quality and the remuneration of drivers, recommendations around improving the safety and accessibility for consumers, providing better fare incentives to operators and reducing unnecessary fees and charges, establishing a central booking system for users who have disabilities, requiring talking taxi meters in all taxis to enhance accessibility, extending the multi-purpose taxi program to seniors who currently do not have access to a motor vehicle, providing public transport travel passes to users of the multi-purpose taxi program, ensuring that the Taxi Services Commission receives adequate funding, and providing more flexible use of taxis and allowing use to be more innovative in how it's implemented. We do believe that there are a number of areas where the recommendations could be strengthened, clarified or altered to improve outcomes for taxi users, particularly those who are experiencing disadvantage. And there are some key ones that we want to highlight in our brief presentation today. The first is around ensuring the accessibility standards remain stringent for vehicles. We believe that there's a risk that the current recommendation lowers the bar, and we see this as a key risk given that the industry to date has not prioritised accessibility compliance measures. Second, specifying the features of the central booking system. We are very much supportive of the central booking system, believe that it will drive significant improvements. We believe that the central booking system should be a booking system for accessibility rather than just for solely what users. We believe that strengthening the requirements for driver training and assessment is very important, and this should extend to increasing the accessibility, awareness and understanding of all drivers, not only new drivers, and also for drivers of conventional cabs, not only what taxis. We believe there should be free access to child restraints as part of a universally accessible service. There's a need to incorporate accessibility into taxi rank design. Also believe there needs to be a stronger emphasis around, explicit emphasis around emphasising the roles of consumers and their advocates in the implementation of any recommendations. Ensuring that consumers and consumer advocates have sufficient resources to be able to participate and assist with the implementation. Guarding against a fall in the number of WAT licences as being quite important. Ensuring the Taxi Services Commission remains under the full coverage of the Transport Integration Act 2010, and allowing for not-for-profit community transport providers equal consideration in examining the transport options in low-density areas where taxis might not be the only options. So they're the key areas that we're wanting to highlight today, and yeah, obviously questions.
And with this general idea, you have to guard against watering down accessibility standards while allowing more flexibility and quality for some of the taxi fleet. You might have some juggling or balance issues there. Have you any thoughts on how you kind of optimise in this field?
Certainly, from the consultations we've done, the work that we've done over the past few years around accessibility standards, it's quite clear that two quite different approaches emerge. The first is, do you, I guess, try and in fact support or direct the creation of a more accessible vehicle with the appropriate funding to do so. So you actually design an accessible taxi vehicle, and New York has kind of gone through a process similar to that, so that you actually can stipulate, here is the vehicle that we want you to use, and start rolling that out across the fleet. Or the alternative is to try and create a variety of different vehicles in the fleet that are able to accommodate a variety of different needs. And I guess part of our concern about the idea, which the report tends to support, that you allow a bit more wiggle room around the disability standards in order that it might be less costly for vehicle modifications to occur with the existing fleet, is that over the longer term that doesn't give you a platform on which to build a more accessible vehicle. So while it is entirely true that they may have some very good short-term effects, and indeed there are a number of consumers who are quite supportive of this approach, in the longer term, that doesn't give you a pathway to saying, well, in order to meet the standard, well, you need to design a new vehicle and actually be incorporating that into the fleet.
Yep. Yep. And the central booking system, how would you see people like yourselves and what users engaging with the Taxi Commission on getting that working to your satisfaction and satisfaction of what users? Any thoughts on what are the requirements for working with them?
And look, I certainly think there is a requirement to be able to have a deeper engagement with consumers. While we're very welcoming of the current Disabled Persons Taxi Advisory Committee, and indeed we are represented on it, it tends to be quite a very shallow means of obtaining feedback from users. That it's a 3-hour meeting 3 times a year. Often with a very short presentation, a bit of discussion, and then the items move on. So the ability to engage at a deeper level with the consumers, the ability for consumers to build a knowledge base on which they can advocate, the ability for consumers to have prolonged and deep access with the Commission isn't available in the current setup. So being able to have the capacity for consumers to firstly be educated about and educate themselves about the depth of some of the issues, and they're often very technical issues which can't necessarily be dealt with in a quick session, as well as having the capacity to reach a wide variety of users. 20 people around the room is a useful feedback mechanism, but it often doesn't communicate the issues out into the community where the information and the feedback is needed most. So certainly having those capabilities, be they done by the Commission itself or done by another party on behalf of the Commission, to get that deeper level of engagement, a deeper understanding of the consumer experience, and a deeper, I guess, ability to forecast what the likely effects of regulatory change are going to be on the consumer experience, is what is going to be needed for the reforms to be implemented smoothly.
Yep.
Thanks for your submission and your participation generally in the inquiry has been quite extensive. So we've had lots of interactions, and so many of the issues I think that you've raised we've had discussions with. So I suppose the only issue I wanted to raise was around driver training and so on, because you've made comments about how that should be done, particularly in respect of disability awareness and so on. Maybe you could comment on that.
Sure. I guess it's a concern that's been raised with us quite a number of times, and I also understand that the Human Rights Commission has made some similar comments around whether the existing training framework is in fact adequate. I guess the draft report suggests that the competencies themselves are adequate, and it's just a matter of better rollout and implementation. I guess we question that to some extent and says, actually, are the competencies in a 4-week training course really sufficient to get people to the place that we believe that they need to be? And also, I guess, particularly around accessibility, around accessible service provision, these are often skills that are developed over a longer period of time. And having the capacity to do refresher training, having the capacity to, in fact, come back and assess how these things are going, as well as having a complaint system that's responsive to concerns that are raised, is a process of changing the culture of taxi service provision. And in creating that cultural change, just saying you have to pass a particular test right at the beginning of your career is probably unlikely to have a great deal of effect on some of the practices which are often reinforced and continued in the culture of the industry, and is unlikely to be a solution by itself. So I guess our proposal is to actually have a more extensive training and feedback mechanism where, in fact, drivers, while after initially completing training, would actually have the capacity to have these attitudinal and behavioural aspects of their work continue to be assessed and regularly assessed, as well as the capacity to provide ongoing support and training to ensure that they understand the impacts of their behaviours. Sorry, I had an additional point, but it's...
And what role do you think VCOS could play in that, or do you see VCOS playing?
I don't see VCOS playing a particular role in that, but I do see the Taxi Services Commission playing a particular role in that, in terms of providing the environment in which taxi drivers operate, as well as, I guess, the other element that people have suggested is whether, in fact, the qualification should be higher, and whether a Certificate 2 is really, which is not a particularly high-level qualification, is really the appropriate level of qualification for the type of service that we're looking at. And I guess to reinforce Carolyn's points, that there's a strong view that, an awful lot of people with disabilities don't just use wheelchair-accessible taxis, they also use the conventional fleet, and that those elements and those drivers also need to be captured in the mix, rather than concentrating solely on the wheelchair-accessible taxis.
And just in terms of, because the final report, we need to comment on transitional issues and so on. Where do you see the priorities for early reforms happening? Do you place any particular priorities? Because there's a whole package of stuff there.
Certainly, I think the proposal that attracts the most commentary and indeed attention with the consumers that we represent is the central booking system. Being able to get a more streamlined process for both people to book services, as well as, in fact, to centralise the coordination of taxis, so that those continuing discrepancies between timeliness for different types of vehicles can be addressed quickly and early. I think that's going to be one of the biggest drivers of improvement in customer experience and the customer attitude to the service, and will very likely result in improved take-up of the services more generally.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your submission, and it's quite detailed, and we're looking at it.